So good afternoon and welcome to those just joining. My name's Keith Golding. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Ecological Continuity Trust, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 38th webinar in our webinar series. Today we're delighted to have Dr. Mike Peacock from the University of Liverpool talking to us about 15 years of research at the Migneint Bog Peat Rewetting experiment in Wales. So Mike, thanks for agreeing to do that. Mike is a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool and a researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. He researches greenhouse gas and carbon cycling in wetlands and freshwaters. He's particularly interested in methane emissions and the role of small water bodies, that's ditches, ponds and pools, in the global carbon cycle. He's already recorded a podcast about Migneint with Ben, and so that's up now and available to watch or to listen to if you want some extra information following on from this webinar. And of course, the webinar will be up on the web fairly soon afterwards as Ben has the chance to edit it and put it up. So Mike, thank you for agreeing to talk to us today. If I could just ask all participants, apart from you, to turn off your cameras and microphones so that we maximize bandwidth. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat facility, which is that little white outline of a speech bubble with a blue dot next to it at the bottom right-hand corner. And then Ben, our executive director, will be monitoring that and will come in with questions, and I might join him as well at the end of the talk. So thanks, Mike. Over to you. Let's see if the technology is working properly.
Brilliant. Thanks for the intro, Keith, and thanks to Ben for the invite to speak. Right. Yeah, so I'm going to give an overview of the research that's been going on the Migneint blanket bog. I will give a very brief intro to peatlands on the assumption that perhaps not everyone quite knows their importance, but I shan't dwell on the background too much. So for those who aren't peaty people, here is a map of how our global peatland area looks like. Lots in the north, lots in the tropics, not so much in the south. So we're interested in them because they don't really take up much space, about 3% of the total land area, but they store a lot of carbon, sort of double the amount of carbon stored in global forests. They're a really important carbon store, and in some places, particularly the UK, they're really important for our drinking water. If we think of all the upland reservoirs in the north of England and Scotland. If we look at just a UK map of peatlands, this is how our peatland looks. Again, some in East Anglia in the lowlands, lots throughout the Pennines in Wales and northern Scotland. And something that's not relevant to what I'm going to talk about today, but I think is an interesting thing to flag up when we're talking about UK peatlands, is actually we have more peat that falls under the UK in the Falklands. So when we're inventorying the greenhouse gas emissions from our peatlands, we also have to inventory for the Falkland Islands, which I think is an interesting geographical quirk. So we've got a lot of peat in the UK. A lot of it isn't in very good condition. So we've damaged our peatlands for all sorts of different reasons, which these photos hopefully give an overview of. We've got about 20% in what we're calling near natural condition. If we're thinking of sort of our upland moors, whether we've got maybe some drainage, but still some nice heather and sphagnum. We've got 41% semi-natural. Again, we've still got some drainage and burning and grazing. And then we move down this list into the ones we've really trashed. Peatlands that we've drained for conifer plantations. If we think of East Anglia or the Lancashire mosses, where we've got lots of arable farming going on peatlands, we dig it up, or we used to dig it up for horticulture. So all these different reasons, we've drained and trashed our peatlands and destroyed them. And this was all done with good intentions. It was done for economies and for production. But we know that this is, losing those water stores, it's losing our carbon stores. And now we want to start putting these wrongs right. So this drainage has various effects. It loses the carbon that's been stored to the atmosphere, and that goes into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. We lose carbon in the rivers that drain these peatlands as dissolved organic carbon. And if you've ever stood on a river draining a peatland, you will get this typical peaty brown colour. That is carbon. Carbon has that sort of brown colour. So we know that drainage causes more carbon to be lost down river. Drainage leads to lower emissions of methane, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas. That's sort of a good side effect, but naturally wetlands should emit methane, so we shouldn't really be too bothered. And we know it's not good for biodiversity as well. There's lots of animals that live on these peatlands that depend on the wet character of them. And if we drain them, we make them drier, and it's not so good for biodiversity. So in theory, if we go and re-wet and restore our peatlands, we should undo all these negative effects and put things back on the trajectory they used to be. And so that leads me on to the site I'm going to talk about today, the Migneint. So for those who know North Wales, we're a little bit south of Betis y Coed and a little bit east of Blaenau Festiniog. The Migneint is the second largest blanket bog in North Wales. It runs from a little way south of Betis y Coed, pretty much all the way down to Dolgelly as the special area of conservation. It's been drained for sheep and for forestry and for grouse, but there isn't any grouse shooting here. There's not much grouse shooting in Wales commercially anymore. So mainly for sheep. And it has a long history of research, even going way back before what I'm going to talk about today. There are papers by Jeff Blackford and Ellis and Tallis from decades and decades ago looking at peat chemistry and acidification of some of the lakes up there. And I'll try and include some photos. Here's how it sometimes looks when we're up on the bog. It doesn't always look like this. So, we've got sloping hills, we've got these areas of sort of mire flushes, which are slightly more alkaline, and then we've got the rolling blanket bog in the background. So to introduce the site history, the current experiment that I'm going to talk about kicked off with a DEFRA project, which was led by Andy Baird at Leeds as the PI, with Pippa Chapman and Joe Holden as co-Is at Leeds, and Chris Evans at CH as the co-I team. And it's owned by the National Trust. So this project ran from 2010 to 2015. This is what I did my PhD research on. And we had what we thought was a really nice experimental design. We had 12 parallel ditches running down this hill slope, where you can see on the LiDAR on the right, they're running downhill into this stream at the bottom of the hill slope, the Avon Dee, and this stream drains off. So a really nice, ditches quite close together, hill slope scale experiment. And then we went, we didn't, the contractors Dinsdale came along and did some ditch blocking. So we left 4 of these ditches open as control and block ditches. The other 8 were blocked using a couple of different methods, one called damming, where we're just digging up the peat and putting this peat in the ditches to create dams. And a second one called reprofiling, where we're doing these dams and then we're also squashing the ditch down and trying to remove that ditch line entirely. And so the bottom left photo was taken the day after the ditch blocking took place, and we could already see all this water pooling behind the dams, a really nice encouraging sign that we're going to try and hold some of that water back on the site and maybe lead to some wetter conditions. I like to include this. Rewetting is not without controversy, and it still is not without controversy in places like East Anglia. And the local farmers, the tenant farmers here, really weren't happy with what the National Trust were planning. This is one of the quotes that I like to include from one of the local tenant farmers. Even if just a few ditches are blocked, it will make the whole area wetter. Maybe they want us to start growing rice. So there was quite a lot of local opposition in the first place before things started. That sort of melted away. One of the reasons is that as the contractors were blocking the ditches, they did find quite a few lambs that had already died in the ditches when they were unblocked because they'd fallen in and couldn't get out. So the farmers sort of realized that, one, they had been losing sheep to the bog as it already was. And then they saw that actually the rewetting isn't really changing the bog that different. It's, it still looks like it is, the sheep can still get around, and they sort of came around to the idea. So for this DEFRA project, the rewetting took place in February 2011. As I said, we had this controlled and replicated design where we've got our unblocked ditches and our blocked ditches. And then we measured loads and loads of different things. And I'm going to go into some detail of some of the papers that came out of this in the next slides and show a little bit more detail. But we took baseline samples for soil chemistry to learn about the chemistry of the peat. We measured water tables across the site using quite an incredible number of dip wells, some of which were automated and some of which we were manually measuring. We were looking at water tables and hydrology, flow rates down the ditches and across the land. We were looking at the water chemistry in the ditches, in the soil water, in the overland flow. And we were looking at the concentrations of the different forms of aquatic carbon that can come down these ditches. So our dissolved and particulate organic carbon and our dissolved greenhouse gases, methane and CO2. We were looking at greenhouse gas emissions from the terrestrial areas and the ditches, and vegetation surveys over time as well. So, a whole lot of different things going on in this experiment. After the DEFRA project finished in 2015, the vegetation monitoring has carried on via National Resources Wales on a 2-year basis. In that LiDAR image earlier, I showed you one stream draining our section of bog. There's another stream draining another section of bog as a sort of paired catchment. And UKCH have been measuring the water chemistry in those streams for decades, from way before the restoration, and that is carrying on. And the National Trust are also up to lots of things up there, restoration research as part of the Upper Conway project. 2022, I moved back to the UK from spending some time in Sweden. So carried on picking up some work at the site with undergraduate and master's students doing various greenhouse gas focused work. 2024, we had a PhD student, Laura Bohr, start at Liverpool, and this has been one of her main sites. And then last year, we had European funding for, I've got the date wrong, 2025 to 2018. It's not going back in time. 2025 to 2028, this project is running for, where we're doing some new measurements and analysing the historic CEH data. So that's sort of a potted overview of the sort of recent history of the site with the rewetting focus. And now I'm going to sort of talk through some of the papers, show some of the results, and we'll have some photos as well so people can see how the bog looks like. So this is something I did for my PhD, where we wanted to see what happened to the bog pools that were forming following the ditch blocking. We saw that photo before, where immediately the day after the ditch blocking, we had the water pooling behind the dam. So we've increased the standing water across the whole site. We've got some bog pools that are quite little, some bog pools that are quite big. And in this little study, we measured 60 bog pools 18 months after the rewetting to try and understand how the vegetation was colonizing them and what this might mean for carbon cycling. So both of these graphs are showing our 60 pools going from shallow on the left to deep at the right. The top graph, we're looking at sphagnum cover up the vertical axis, and the bottom, we're looking at the Eriophorum cover, the cotton grass. So we can see in our top graph, as our pools get deeper, we have more sphagnum coverage. The sphagnum likes these deeper pools. In the bottom one, we can see that as the pools get deeper, we have less Eriophorum. The black dots are when we only have Eriophorum in the margins of the pool, not in the centers. So why do we care about this? Well, one of the reasons is that peatland people really like sphagnum. I will slightly pick my words carefully, because I was going to say that we like to think of sphagnum as being really peat forming. I noticed Andreas is here, and I know Andreas takes issue with this focus on sphagnum being the only peat former. Other plants can form peat as well. And we care about Eriophorum because it has erenchomatous tissue in it, like chimneys within it. And we know that this can act as a conduit for methane to the atmosphere. And elsewhere on the Migneint, after ditch blocking, we saw that this area of cotton grass, it became real hotspots for methane emission after rewetting. So we can think maybe if we have more sphagnum in the pools, it's going to be better for reducing these methane emissions. So we were staying on the subject of vegetation. This was a study led by Sophie Green, who was a postdoc with Andy Baird at Leeds when I was doing my PhD, and with some people from NRW here, looking at the sort of first few years of post-rewetting and how the terrestrial vegetation responded. So not in the bog pools, on the terrestrial parts of the bog, how is it responding to this ditch blocking? And it was quite a good null result, I think, really. So here we're looking at year since blocking. We've got our control open ditches on the left of each clump. And then we've got our block ditches, our dammed and our reprofiled through each year. And we're looking at the mean leaf length of the cotton grass again. So we found, or they found, I wasn't part of this, an increase in sphagnum over time, regardless of the treatment. So we can see that sphagnum is changing with time, not due to the ditch blocking. And there was no clear effect of ditch blocking on the vegetation species of the Eriophorum, the cotton grass, or the sphagnum in those first 5 years after rewetting. Then we had a trilogy of papers looking at the watery side of things in hydrological processes. This was one led by Joe Holden at Leeds. So looking at the hydrology, what happened to the hydrology when all these ditches were blocked? So on the right, we're looking at a photo. We've got a V-notch weir in the ditch, which we're using to measure flow down the ditches. This incredible contraption in front of the V-notch weir is measuring the overland flow. So we sunk some boards into the bog to direct the overland flow down into these drain pipes. Then the drain pipes funnels the overland flow into the box. We've got a water logger in the box measuring the water table height and a sort of mini V-notch here so we could quantify the flow of the water overland. I thought this was a really cool thing that Joe came up with, really ingenious. So here we're looking at all 12 of our ditches, and we can see what treatment they're assigned to, our reprofiled and our dammed, our ditch block treatments, and our open ditches. And we're looking at the discharge of water down each of these ditches. So first thing to say is that it was really difficult to quantify the catchments of each of these ditches. We tried to do it looking at the topography and saying, well, the land is higher here, the water must flow into this ditch. But when we did the hydrological balances, we found actually it didn't add up. The inputs and the outputs, the rainfall and the water out didn't match up. So we assumed that these ditches are taking water from across the hills. There'll be sort of subsurface flow. There might be some peat pipes. It was really, really difficult to quantify. And that's a good lesson, I think, in general for anyone trying to figure out the catchments of these small headwater ditches. To point out that we've got the blocked lines, the dashed lines when the ditch blocking took place on each of these. So we have a baseline period. And we can quite clearly see, if we look at our open ditches, we've got more of these black spikes. This is more flow coming down the ditches. If we compare to some of the block ditches, we can see the discharge. There's a lot less water flowing down the ditches. That's not surprising. We've put these dams in, there's less water coming down the ditches. So we also found in this paper that there was a lot of overland flow in the reprofiled and the dammed and the open ditches. A lot of the water is flowing over the surface of the bog. And finally, we had another really spectacular null result. There was very little effect of the ditch blocking on the water table in the bog itself. There was the occasional hint that maybe it was wetter around some of the dammed ditches, but it wasn't all that very convincing. So the next paper in this sort of series was led by Chris Evans at CH. It was using these water balances from Joe's paper to look at the fluvial carbon export, how much carbon is flowing down the ditches, and the concentrations of that carbon as well. So we're thinking about this dissolved organic carbon that gives us this brown colour in our ditches. How does the ditch blocking affect the amount of carbon coming out? So again, we've got this difficulty in assessing the small catchments and where they start and end, made it quite difficult to figure out the flows, and therefore makes it quite difficult to figure out how much carbon is coming down the ditches. But again, we've got quite a nice null result. There was no difference here. We're looking at dissolved organic carbon, and we've got our 3 different treatments of ditches, the open ditches and our 2 different kinds of block ditches. And over time, we can see that in summer, our concentrations go up when things are warmer, concentrations come down in winter. We have this nice seasonal cycle, but overall there's not a whole lot going on between those ditches. Maybe here we have a slight peak in the reprofiled ditches where the DOC concentrations were higher, the carbon concentrations were higher. And as well as this, we found no difference in the dissolved methane, the carbon dioxide, or the particulate organic carbon in the ditches. We found no difference in the DOC concentrations in the soil water or the overland flow. Really, really spectacular null result once again. So something I want to divert to briefly. In Joe's paper, we saw that we had less water flowing down the ditches. if we have no difference in our concentrations of carbon in the ditches, we might be tempted to assume that ditch blocking is lowering the carbon lost from site because there's less flow down the ditches. And other people have made this assertion. We don't think this works for blanket bogs because, as I said, we've got a lot of overland flow. So instead of having water flowing down the ditches, we're having water flowing over the surface of the bog. We can't physically hold back so much extra water on site to close the water balance. So we can't say that this water is not leaving site, is being held on site, because we know what evapotranspiration rates are. So the water is just leaving the site by other pathways, by overland flow, by subsurface flow in peat pipes. And therefore the net export, the net loss of aquatic carbon is not different. Ditch blocking didn't have an effect. But we can also look at this paired stream data from CH, from the two streams draining one, our ditch block experimental site, the Avon Dee, and another catchment nearby, the Nantaburin, which was unblocked when we did this analysis. So we've got this pre-blocking series of DOC data. Again, we're seeing the peaks in summer when things are warmer. In February 2011, our ditches are blocked, and then we still carry on seeing these seasonal cycles. But like in that previous DOC graph, we do have maybe the whisper that in the summer following the ditch blocking, DOC concentrations were possibly higher at the catchment where the ditches were blocked. So maybe we see a localized disturbance, the ditches are blocked, we're churning up all this peat, more carbon runs into the rivers, and at the catchment scale, maybe we do see a slight difference, but it's not sustained. There's no clear effect up to 2017 here. What is interesting, because I mentioned the farmers before, in the village below the bog, there was this local perception that actually the water colour had changed, that the water had got less coloured, which would be less carbon coming off it. And the locals thought that the river through the village had also got less flashy and the flows were lower. We never measured these things at the village. And I think it's a really interesting thing whether it did change or whether it was just a placebo effect, that the locals knew that all this work had been going on the bog, and therefore they assumed it would have an effect, and therefore they saw an effect. So I think that's an interesting sociological side effect of what was going on. So mostly a null result for our DOC, our aquatic carbon concentrations. The third paper in this trilogy was looking at the composition of that carbon in the water. So we looked at lots of different metrics to understand the molecular composition of the carbon in the water. Here we're looking at something called SUVA, which is sort of how aromatic that carbon is. This is important because it will affect how easy or difficult it is to treat drinking water. The more aromatic it is, it's harder for water companies to treat. And we're looking at ditch water on the top. We're looking at our soil water on the middle and our overland flow on the bottom over several years. Again, we've got our three different treatments represented by different colours, our open ditches, our dam ditches, and our reprofiled ditches. And for all the different metrics of the composition of this carbon, we found mostly nothing happening again. In some cases, we did find little differences, but the effect sizes were very small. And some of the differences that we did see were apparent in the baseline data before we did the intervention of the ditch blocking. So it was sort of small scale variation driven by the bog itself, not by the intervention. So yet another mostly null result. I should also point out that although this didn't improve things, it didn't make things worse, which is really a point to make. You know, some people think that if we're going to re-wet these systems, it might worsen the quality of carbon. We might have more carbon coming out of them. Actually, there was no net effect. It was overall neutral for these things here. So lots of null results. What is going on? So there are two possibilities, not mutually exclusive. This is a paper from CH with National Trust and NRW again, where Jenny Williamson did some LiDAR work. They put some rust rods into the ground to try and understand where the water tables were. And they came up with this really nice self-rewetting hypothesis. So in A here, we've got our peat surface in brown, and we've dug a ditch in the middle of it. We dig that ditch and the water surface in blue declines. We've made things drier, the water table declines. But then because we've made it drier, the bog starts to lose carbon, it starts to oxidize, and the surface subsides because that peat literally turns to CO2 and goes into the atmosphere. So the surface of the bog follows the water table down and it sort of re-wets itself. And this would explain everything. It would explain why we didn't find much of an effect of ditch blocking because the bog had re-wet itself. It would explain why we didn't find an effect on the aquatic carbon. Of course, this doesn't mean the re-wetting didn't have an effect because we've still created all those bog pools, which were potentially great habitats for invertebrates. We were on site this week and there was a team from Butterfly Conservation surveying for large heath who apparently are very happy butterflies up on these wet bogs. But that would explain our null result. The second one, of course, is time. As I said to Ben in the podcast we recorded, peat forms over millennia. Can we really expect a response in sort of 5 years after we've come along and done an intervention? And not necessarily. We know peat changes over years, decades, centuries, millennia, and therefore that's why we're interested in staying on site to see what is going to happen in the future. Will we start picking up responses in the coming years? And so I'm going to sort of close shortly by saying what we're doing now and present a few preliminary results. So here we're back to our paired streams that we looked at the CH DOC data. And this is work that John King, my postdoc, has been doing, bringing the analysis right up to date. So the Avon Dee was the catchment where we had our ditch blocking experiment. The Nantaburin was the one where in our last graph it hadn't been ditch blocked. Since we published that paper, the ditch blocking has taken place there. So each stream we've got our pre and post ditch blocking. And we're looking at our DOC concentrations from the early 2000s up to sort of 2025. So mostly we're not really seeing much of an effect on the ditch blocking in either. What is really interesting, in both of the right-hand graphs, we can see DOC concentrations rising really quite steeply in recent years. Our current hypothesis, this is really nicely related to air temperature. We've had some very warm summers. Earlier we saw those seasonal cycles in the DOC. We know when things are warmer, microbes are working faster and they're sort of eating more peat, they're releasing more DOC into the waters. So it could be that we're having an effect where the temporal temperature signal is overriding any effect of the rewetting in this data. This is very preliminary. The graphs look awful, as you can see, but there's more to come on this. And coming back to Laura Bohr, my PhD student, she's been really interested in the aquatic greenhouse gases from these bog pools. And I want to caveat this by saying these bog pools do emit methane, and we should be aware of that. This isn't a reason not to restore our peatlands, because healthy wetlands, healthy peatlands emit methane. It's just what they do. The microbes that live in wetlands, they're just suited to living in damp, low oxygen conditions. It's where they like to live. They like to emit methane. We shouldn't blame wetlands for emitting methane, but we do need to understand how much methane they emit so we can put it into inventories and budgets and models. So again, this is really preliminary. Some work Laura did measuring about 126 bog pools across the entire Migneint. So each bar is representing one bog pool at one point in time. We've got our methane concentrations up the side. And the point to emphasize here is the sheer variability. We're going from less than 1 to over 1,000 orders of magnitude differences in methane concentration. Whenever we look at methane data, it's always like this. It's always really skewed. We always get these rare but real high emitting sites. And so Laura's ongoing work is trying to quantify this variability. We're using these 24-hour chambers that we float on the bog pools to try and capture methane bubbles to understand how much methane bubbles out of the peat, because that's not very well constrained in any ecosystem at all. So I'll finish there. Hopefully I haven't talked for too long. Hopefully people enjoyed it, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.